Hey guys, tonight we step into the blistering, sweat-drenched shoes of a medieval blacksmith, where the heat doesn't just hug you, it full-on smothers you. Imagine standing next to a furnace so hot it could fry an egg on your elbow all day every day. You probably won't survive this, but lucky for you, this story isn't about actually swinging a hammer. It's about what it felt like when you did. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake before dawn, not because you want to, but because the forge demands it. Your clothes, oh those clothes, are heavy with soot sweat, and the unmistakable scent of burnt wool, mixed with something vaguely reminiscent of despair. You're not just wearing a tunic and leather apron. You're draped in a layer of medieval hard labour. Your arms ache before you even pick up the hammer, but there's no rest until the day's work is done, or until your body simply gives out, whichever comes first. Forget Instagram influencers showing off their glistening workout sweat. Your sweat smells like smoke and failure. Actually, scratch that failure is what happens if you slip up. Hit it harder, your father barks from across the forge. His voice is rough, like he's swallowed gravel and held onto it for decades. He's not the encouraging type. He's the "your blisters are just part of the apprenticeship" type. By the time you're 6, you're already stoking fires, hauling buckets of water, and enduring burns that would send a modern-day chef sprinting for the ice pack. You quickly learn that the forge doesn't care if it's a holiday, a feast day, or your 10th birthday. There's always an urgent order, a sword to sharpen, a horseshoe to replace a ploughshare to mend. Your hands are blistered, blackened and cracked, but they're your livelihood, and they don't get the memo about taking breaks. The hammer is practically an extension of your arm, albeit a painful one, that reminds you daily how not to hold it, and your feet. Let's just say they've memorised every hot patch on the floor the hard way. Historians still argue whether medieval blacksmiths were considered heroes or just necessary background noise. You know you're somewhere in between, a crucial cog in the medieval machine that no one thanks unless their gate falls off or their knight shows up with a dull sword just before a battle. But here's a quirky tidbit for you while you're melting iron and sweating through your tunic. Medieval forges often had no chimneys. Yep, that's right. Smoke just filled the entire workshop, making your eyes water constantly and turning your lungs into a lifetime subscription to the coffin club. Protective gear. The closest you get is a rag tied around your face, which quickly becomes saturated with sweat and smells worse than the forge itself. Somehow you learn to breathe through it all. It's like your body's been chemically engineered to inhale smoke and exhale determination. You're not a kid anymore, you're a blacksmith in training. That means no playing with wooden swords in the field, no chasing chickens, just endless hammer swings, more soot than skin visible, and a master who believes tears are for the weak. You learn quickly to keep your mouth shut when a knight insults your work, or you'll be the one dodging flying horseshoes the rest of the week. And speaking of knights, those pampered aristocrats, with their shiny armour and gleaming swords, you're the one who makes those weapons, yet they barely spare you a glance. Beyond the grunt of good enough, payment, sometimes coin, often stale bread, and occasionally, if you're really lucky, a dead chicken that isn't even fit for soup. One time, a man tried to pay you with onions, 3 onions. You still laugh about it, except when you're crying quietly in the corner. The forge is relentless, demanding and unforgiving, and yet paradoxically it's where you find purpose. The moment a horseshoe fits just right, or a blade gleams under your gaze, there's a flicker of pride. You're not just a smelly, blister-covered peasant, you're a creator, a craftsman, the hidden backbone of your village. Without you, the wheels stop turning, the gates fall down, and the swords dull. You matter, even if no one sings songs about you. That said, you're also slowly dying a little every day. Your knees creak like old wooden doors, your fingers have long forgotten the softness of childhood, and your lungs have that permanent smokehouse rasp. You're young, but your body feels decades older. It's a life sentence handed down by fire and steel, and the only inheritance you're certain of is pain and endurance. But the forge doesn't just shape metal, it shapes you. It teaches resilience, patience, and an intimate knowledge of heat rhythm and timing. The clang of hammer on iron is a brutal symphony you dance to, often without realizing it. Sometimes late at night you dream of the forge of sparks raining down, bellows wheezing, and the hiss of molten metal meeting water. Sleep isn't an escape, it's an extension of the grind. So now that you've stepped into the smoky boots of a medieval blacksmith, don't think this is the only way medieval folks faced danger. There were plenty more vermin that didn't just annoy weather, that could starve, and diseases lurking in every shadow. But before we get to those, take a deep breath if you can, and prepare for the next challenge in this relentless medieval adventure. Because if you thought the forge was hot, wait until you meet the real tiny tyrants crawling under your roof. So you've survived the hellfire of the forge and the relentless, back-breaking labour of being a medieval blacksmith in training. Congratulations. But don't get too comfortable, because lurking just beyond the glow of molten metal and beneath the rough timber rafters of your humble abode, a microscopic army is preparing to wage war on you. Welcome to the delightful world of medieval vermin, rats, fleas, lice, and all their itchy, disease-carrying buddies. First off, rats. These aren't your cuddly city park pals. These are medieval rat kings of the underworld. Giant, terrifying, and downright ruthless. Picture a rat so fat from scavenging your meagre scraps that it looks like it could burst at any second. These rodents ran the show in the dark corners of the village, in granary stables, and even your home. And it wasn't just the sight of them scuttling across the floorboards that made you want to burn the whole place down. It was what they carried with them. Yes, those tiny feet were little ferries for fleas and disease. Speaking of fleas, these minuscule vampires weren't just annoying little bloodsuckers. They were the medieval plague's main delivery system. Fleas like to hitch rides on rats and people alike, biting you and then moving on before you even noticed. Their bites itched like 1,000 tiny medieval needles, causing you to scratch yourself raw until you looked like you'd lost a fight with a wild boar. It's a miracle anyone kept any skin intact at all. Fun fact, some flea infestations were so severe they earned names like the Dancing Plague, because people would literally twitch and jump from the maddening itch. Then there were lice, the crowning glory of medieval personal hygiene. And by crowning glory, I mean never-ending nightmare. These little devils lived in your hair and clothes, laying eggs that hatched and multiplied faster than you could say soap. Bathing was a rare luxury, mostly reserved for nobles and monks, and even monks weren't that regular about it. So lice had a royal banquet on your scalp every day. Imagine feeling something crawling in your hair, but it's your new normal. Gross, right? Well, historians still argue whether lice infestations contributed significantly to spreading disease, or mostly just caused embarrassment and itching. Either way, lice were a big deal. Here's a quirky tidbit that'll make you cringe and laugh the Rat King. This was an actual phenomenon where a bunch of rats got their tails tangled together, probably by sticky sap or mud, and then lived as one twisted, squirming mass of rat fury. Medieval people thought these Rat Kings were ominous portents of doom. Whether that's true, or just a case of rats having terrible hygiene, is up for debate. Your medieval ancestors never had the luxury of pest control sprays or exterminators. The best defence was a cat which was sometimes suspected of witchcraft. Themselves talk about your enemies, both furry and feared. Rats often lived cheek by jowl with humans, gnawing on food stores, spreading disease, and generally being the unwanted housemates who never cleaned up after themselves. Now, if you think these vermin were just nuisances during the day, think again. Nights were their playground. Fleas and lice didn't clock out when the fire went down. Know the itching, scratching and irritation continued until you were a sleep-deprived, miserable mess. Sleep was precious, yet your body was under constant assault from these tiny tormentors. Historians still argue about how much vermin truly influenced medieval mortality rates. But what's undeniable is that these pests made daily life a lot more unpleasant and a lot riskier than most modern folk imagine. The presence of these creatures meant constant discomfort and a high risk of disease, which was the leading cause of death far before swords or starvation finished the job. And here's the kicker: you probably shared your bed with some of these guests. Bed bugs were another nocturnal menace, sneaking bites under the cover of darkness and leaving you wondering why you woke up looking like you had a bad allergic reaction. Your mattress might have been straw or animal hair, but it was also a 5-star resort for bugs. But let's lighten the mood a bit. There's something oddly comedic in imagining medieval villagers trying to swat invisible fleas or blaming their neighbour's chicken for a rat invasion. There's even evidence that some folk kept records of their itchiest nights, which is the closest thing to a medieval diary anyone might have had. Despite their maddening presence, these vermin weren't just annoyances, they were life shapers. They influenced settlement patterns, hygiene practices, and even social dynamics. People often blamed neighbours for spreading lice or rats, fueling distrust and social tension. The vermin were more than just pests. They were silent forces affecting everything from health to community cohesion. So next time you complain about a mosquito buzzing in your ear, remember your medieval ancestors who battled rat kings and flea armies while trying to make a living, eat a meal, and get some badly needed rest. And while you've been scratching your head literally, the weather outside hasn't been any kinder, ready to throw its own medieval tantrum at any moment. You've dealt with the furnace and battled the vermin, but now let's turn our gaze outward toward the skies and fields that were supposed to sustain you, but often seem determined to sabotage your entire existence. The weather in medieval times wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a ruthless, unpredictable force with a flair for disaster that could reduce months of hard work to a muddy, miserable memory in the blink of an eye. Imagine waking up to find the sky as angry as your scowling blacksmith father. One moment the sun blazes down like a medieval spotlight, and the next clouds roll in, dumping rain so heavy it feels like the gods have taken up a new hobby, flooding your village. Crops, your precious breadbasket, drown in waterlogged fields or shrivel under unforgiving drought. Farmers and peasants alike knew all too well that the whims of the weather could decide whether you'd eat or starve. You probably think about modern weather forecasts and weather apps, but medieval folks, they had the next best thing. Superstition, folklore and guesswork. Red sky at night, shepherd's delight might have helped, but when the skies opened up unexpectedly, there was no one to blame but the capricious elements and maybe a bit of bad luck. Historians still argue whether medieval climate fluctuations contributed more to social upheaval than wars or plagues. But the consensus is clear. Weather could be a silent, invisible enemy with a talent for chaos. Now here's a quirky medieval fact. The Little Ice Age, a centuries-long period of cooler temperatures that started around the 14th century, meant harsher winters, shorter growing seasons, and more frequent crop failures. Imagine your ancestors shivering through months where rivers froze and famine whispered its icy breath over villages. If you think your last winter was cold, try living without central heating, insulated walls, or even a decent blanket. Spoiler alert, it wasn't fun. But medieval folks weren't just helpless victims. They developed clever, if sometimes questionable, strategies to cope. Crop rotation, for example, was an early agricultural innovation aimed at preserving soil fertility. Still, farmers often prayed harder than they farmed, holding festivals and rituals to coax the rain to fall at just the right time. Sometimes entire villages would gather to perform rain dances or processions hoping their collective begging might sway the heavens. Modern meteorologists might snicker, but who's to say those heartfelt efforts didn't help, at least by boosting morale? On the flip side, there were the terrifying natural disasters that medieval folks faced with little warning. Floods could wash away homes overnight, droughts could turn fields to dust, and then there were the storms, violent, sudden and utterly unrelenting. A storm wasn't just wet, it was a spectacle of thunderclaps that shook the earth and lightning strikes that could level a barn or start a devastating fire. No one wanted to be caught outside when the sky turned into a tempestuous beast. And there's a fringe theory that some medieval weather oddities were actually the result of volcanic eruptions, like the massive 1257 Samolus eruption, which sent ash clouds around the world and led to years without summer. That's right, while your medieval ancestors struggled to coax crops from frozen soil somewhere, a volcano was busy messing up the climate for decades. Historians still debate how much this eruption contributed to famines and social unrest, but it's clear that nature's backstage drama was both spectacular and deadly. So, what did medieval people do when the weather went wrong? Many simply endured. Communities rationed food, stored grain, and tried to rebuild after every flood or fire. And when it got really bad, people often blamed witches, devils, or divine wrath, linking bad weather to supernatural causes. Because if you don't understand why your fields failed, it's easier to blame a neighbour's broomstick than an invisible climate shift. But here's the kicker. Even when the skies were clear and the crops grew tall, medieval folks never fully escaped the looming threat of bad weather. It was a background drumbeat to every decision: when to plant, when to harvest, how much food to store. One wrong guess could mean months of hunger. And just when you think the weather is your only worry, there's the plague lurking in the shadows, ready to turn your world upside down. All right, you've endured the forge, wrestled with rats, and prayed for mercy from the weather gods. But now it's time to meet the real medieval nightmare, the plague. Imagine a silent, invisible enemy stalking your village, arriving not with a battle cry, but with a sinister cough or a swelling lump the size of a chicken egg under your armpit. Welcome to death's relentless dance, where entire communities could vanish overnight, and no one really understood why. The Black Death, as it would later be called, was the Grim Reaper's greatest medieval hit, wiping out an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population in the 14th century alone. You didn't need a sword to face this enemy. It was transmitted by fleas on rats, those same vermin that already made your life miserable. The infection spread with terrifying speed, turning vibrant towns into ghostly echoes of themselves. Streets emptied, homes were abandoned, and people whispered rumours of curses and divine punishment, while hiding behind masks that looked more like nightmares than protection. You probably think of plague doctors with their beaked masks and dark robes. But here's a fun fact: those masks weren't just for show. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs, supposedly to filter out bad air, which medieval medicine blamed for illness. While modern science laughs at this, it's a fascinating peek into how people desperately tried to make sense of an invisible killer. Historians still argue how effective these doctors really were. But what's undeniable is their iconic image has become a lasting symbol of medieval dread. Medieval folks had no antibiotics or vaccines, only superstition, prayer and quarantine attempts that were often too little too late. When someone showed symptoms, they were usually isolated, but many villages lacked the means or will to enforce proper containment. Families watched helplessly as loved ones succumbed with funerals, held hurriedly, often without proper rites. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it shattered communities, economies and social structures. Here's a quirky and somewhat chilling tidbit: in some places, people believed that cats were to blame for spreading the plague. This led to widespread cat killings, which ironically made the problem worse because fewer cats meant more rats, and more rats meant more plague-carrying fleas. Talk about unintended consequences. But plague wasn't the only killer. Tuberculosis, smallpox, typhus, and dysentery lurked in every corner. Your chance of dying from an infectious disease was shockingly high, especially if you were a child or elderly. Clean water was a luxury, sanitation was medieval at best, and hospitals were places you went to die rather than heal. You might wonder how people coped with such omnipresent mortality. The answer is complex faith played a huge role. The idea that death was a passage to a better place brought comfort, but it also bred fear. Some saw the plague as God's punishment, others as the work of witches or demons. Public flagellations and mass prayers became common, while art and literature of the time reflected this obsession with death and the afterlife. The plague also forced people to adapt. Labour shortages meant peasants could demand better conditions, or wages shaking the rigid medieval social order. Some villages experimented with new farming techniques or trade routes to survive. Even amidst horror, human resilience flickered. As the plague ravaged people's dreams, and waking thoughts were consumed by death and the unknown. Sleep wasn't escape. It was often haunted by visions of skulls, ghosts, and the devil's whispers. Medieval psychology was still in its infancy, but the connection between suffering and supernatural terror was strong. So as death's shadow loomed over you, superstition wasn't just a way to explain the inexplicable, it was survival. And that leads us straight to the medieval obsession with curses, witches, and the ever-present fear of demonic interference. You might think the hardest part of medieval life was the heat of the forge, the plague, or even the rat-infested hovels. But here's the twist for many. The real daily terror was the supernatural, or at least the medieval understanding of it. Curses, witches, demons, and spirits weren't just bedtime stories. They were deeply feared, and sometimes deadly realities. Imagine living in a world where every crop failure illness or broken tool might be blamed on a neighbour's hex. Your cat sneezes must be a witch's familiar. Your barn burns down overnight. Surely the devil's work. People didn't have labs to test germs or meteorologists to explain weather patterns. Instead, they turned to the unseen forces, trying to make sense of chaos by finding someone or something to blame. Witch hunts are often associated with later periods, but even in the Middle Ages, belief in witches and magic was widespread. And it wasn't just peasants. Nobles, clergy, and kings all took the supernatural seriously, sometimes commissioning hunts or trials. The fear of curses was so potent that people carried charms, prayed endlessly, or sought the help of cunning folk, early witch doctors, who promised protection or curses of their own. Here's a medieval fact that might surprise you. Poisonings were so common and paranoia so intense that even everyday disputes could spiral into accusations of witchcraft or sorcery. Got into an argument over land or livestock? Better watch your back. A curse might be your punishment. Some historians still argue whether witch hunts were mostly about genuine fear or political control masked as spiritual battle. And let's talk about curses. They weren't just spoken spells. Medieval people believed curses had real physical effects: bad luck, illness, even death. You might find curses inscribed on lead tablets and buried in the ground, invoking gods or demons to punish your enemies. Talk about medieval troll tactics. Some of these curse tablets have survived, offering a fascinating and creepy glimpse into how seriously these things were taken. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Not all witches were evil, and not all magic was sinister. Some folk were revered as healers or protectors, using herbal remedies and charms to help their communities. But the line between healer and witch was thin and easily crossed, especially when things went wrong. Living in this world meant you always kept an eye out for signs of supernatural interference. Strange noises at night could be spirits or demons. Unexplained illnesses, probably a curse. Some people even carried amulets, tiny objects, blessed or enchanted to ward off evil. Think of them as medieval anxiety blankets. Sleep was no refuge either. Nightmares were believed to be visitations from evil spirits, or worse, the night hag sitting on your chest causing sleep paralysis. Remember how you thought your medieval body was already a torture rack from the forge? Well, now add the fear of being haunted by unseen forces. Good luck drifting off to dreamland peacefully. Despite all the fear, superstition wasn't just about paranoia. It was a way to impose order on a chaotic world and gave people a sense of control, even if it was sometimes illusory. Facing curses and demons was as much psychological as spiritual, a medieval way to process fear and uncertainty. So as you try to get some shut-eye, remember this: medieval folks shared their nights with invisible enemies as terrifying as any sword-wielding knight or fiery furnace. And if the curse didn't get you well, there was always the threat of bad dreams, haunted nights, and the ever-looming danger of restless spirits. Speaking of restless nights, let's talk about the often overlooked but constant medieval companion, the noise, not just the occasional clatter but the cacophony that echoed through villages, keeping you wide-eyed well past your bedtime. If you thought modern life was noisy, spare a thought for the medieval ear. Your daily routine was not just shaped by physical dangers and spectral fears, but by a constant, unavoidable soundtrack that ranged from the charmingly rustic to the outright maddening. Welcome to the medieval orchestra, a relentless mix of shouting vendors, clanging blacksmith hammers, braying animals, and the occasional drunken brawl, all playing at full volume 24/7. There was no concept of quiet hours or noise ordinances back then. Your neighbour's goat might start bleating at dawn, followed by roosters crowing with the enthusiasm of someone who's just discovered caffeine. Street criers hawked their wares with a vocal fervour that could split your eardrums. And don't forget the church bells pealing with such enthusiasm and frequency that even the most devout would dream of earplugs. Sleep was a precious commodity, but between the relentless racket and the tiny tormentors from earlier sections, you had every reason to envy the dead. Historians still argue whether this constant noise contributed to chronic stress or was just background white noise that people adapted to over time. Either way, living in a medieval village meant your ears never got a break. Here's a quirky fact. Some medieval towns had official noise wardens tasked with keeping peace, which mostly meant telling the most obnoxious street performers or rowdy tavern patrons to pipe down. But enforcement was spotty at best, so earplugs made of wax or cloth were the DIY solution of choice. If only they invented bows back then. Animals weren't just a part of life, they were the life of the noise party. Horses clopped down cobbled streets, pigs grunted, dogs barked at suspicious neighbours, and cats prowled for rats, each adding their unique notes to the urban symphony. There are even records of people complaining about noisy neighbours' dogs disturbing their sleep. Sound familiar? Noise wasn't limited to day either. Nighttime brought its own soundtrack: owls hooting, wolves howling in the distance, the occasional scream from the local alehouse brawl spilling out into the streets. If you were unlucky, a sudden storm would hammer rooftops with hail, or shaking trees with thunder that rattled your bones. Good luck getting your 8 hours. And the buildings themselves didn't help. Thick stone walls did little to muffle sounds, and wooden floors creaked with every step. Medieval beds weren't the fluffy, cosy kind either. They often featured wooden frames with straw mattresses that amplified every movement. So if your spouse snored or worse thrashed in a nightmare, you were in for a sleepless night. Now historians debate whether this chronic noise exposure influence medieval behaviour or even social structures? Did constant noise lead to a higher tolerance for chaos or contribute to quicker tempers and more frequent brawls? It's hard to say, but it certainly shaped the medieval experience. Here's the fringe tidbit. Some medieval mystics believed certain sounds could ward off evil spirits. Loud bells or banging pots might keep demons at bay. So some of the noise was intentional spiritual warfare. Imagine your village as a never-ending cacophony of human survival and divine defense. Noise wasn't just a nuisance, it was a force shaping your moods, your health, and your dreams. When you finally collapsed into bed, your mind buzzed not only with worries, but with echoes of the day's relentless soundscape. It's no wonder sleep was elusive, and dreams sometimes offered a welcome escape into silence. But even if you managed to find sleep, your body had another relentless challenge. The grueling toll of medieval labour, which left you aching, broken, and sometimes barely able to move. You faced the blaze of the forge, battled the flea-infested vermin, suffered through the wrath of the weather, stared death in the face with the plague-dodged curses and demons, and endured the constant racket of medieval life. Now it's time to talk about the true body breaker of the Middle Ages, relentless physical labour that didn't just tire you out, it slowly crushed your body like a blacksmith's hammer on red-hot iron. Imagine waking up every day to aches and pains you didn't even know were possible. Your back feels like it's been beaten by a medieval flail, your knees creak louder than the village mill, and your hands, oh your hands are blistered, cracked and stained with so much soot and grime, you barely recognise them as your own. But here's the medieval reality. There was no rest, no ergonomic chairs, no physical therapy, no heating pads. You worked because you had to, not because you wanted to. If you were a peasant, your life was dictated by the seasons and the sweat of your brow. Ploughing fields with a wooden plough that weighed as much as a small horse hauling water from the well, in buckets that could empty your arms in minutes, sowing seeds by hand, harvesting by scythe. Every task demanded strength, stamina, and the ability to ignore pain. And you did this from sun up to sundown 6 days a week, because if you didn't, your family wouldn't eat. Now here's a mainstream historical fact. The average medieval peasant worked about 12 to 14 hours a day during peak seasons. Weekends were for church, which often meant standing through long services with aching feet and sore muscles. Holidays were rare and often shortened by extra labour or community demands. Rest was a luxury only the wealthy could afford. For tradesmen like blacksmiths, cobblers or carpenters, the labour was intense in a different way. Precision endurance and repetitive motions that left muscles stiff and joints screaming. Blacksmiths remember wielded hammers weighing several pounds, swinging hundreds of times a day, forging tools and weapons essential to survival. Their bodies bore the scars of this trade arthritis, tendinitis and countless burns. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval doctors sometimes prescribed leeches to balance humours for people suffering from joint pain or fatigue. It didn't help much, but at least you could say your pain was medically acknowledged. Historians still debate whether some of these treatments did more harm than good, but it's clear medieval medicine wasn't winning any awards. Physical labour wasn't just painful, it was dangerous. One wrong move with a heavy tool or livestock could mean crushed fingers, broken bones, or worse. Imagine hauling sacks of grain up a ladder. When suddenly you slip, that fall might be the end of your work life, or your life itself. Safety equipment, forget it. You had leather boots, a sturdy tunic, and a prayer. The constant physical strain didn't just hurt your body, it affected your mind too. Exhaustion and pain often led to irritability and short tempers. Village brawls were common, sometimes sparked by nothing more than a misstep or a shouted insult after a long day's toil. The medieval saying, "A tired man is an angry man," might as well have been carved into every doorframe. Here's a fringe fact to chew on. Some medieval peasants believed that singing or chanting during work could soothe the pain and even bring better harvests. Whether this was spiritual or just a clever distraction, it shows how people coped with the endless grind. Imagine trying to belt out a tune while hauling manure. Definitely a unique workout. Sleep, when it came, was a brief and often uncomfortable respite. Beds were simple wooden frames stuffed with straw, or hay prone to harbouring lice and bugs. After hours of labour, you'd collapse into this prickly nest, your body aching, but your mind unable to shut down, often replaying the day's hardships or worrying about tomorrow's. Getting a good night's rest was as rare as finding clean water. Despite the brutal toll, this gruelling work was the backbone of medieval society. Without peasants tilling fields, artisans crafting tools, and labourers building structures, castles wouldn't stand, markets wouldn't bustle, and armies wouldn't march. You might not have worn a crown or wielded a sword, but your labour was what kept the medieval world turning. But the physical toll wasn't limited to daylight hours. Remember those nightmares of restless spirits and curses. Your body's pain often bled into your sleep, making every dream a discomforting blend of exhaustion and unease. And with your neighbour's dogs barking, roosters crowing, and the ever-present cacophony sleeping through the night was often a luxury. So as you try to rest your weary limbs, remember the medieval body was a battlefield in itself, worn down not just by external dangers, but by the very work that sustained life. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, there's the matter of medieval diet and nutrition, a topic that might make you grateful for your modern grocery store. By now, you're likely feeling sympathy for your medieval self, worn down by hard labour, plagued by vermin, and haunted by unseen curses. But let's not forget another sneaky villain in this historic drama, the medieval diet. If you thought surviving the forge and fighting off plagues was tough try, doing it on a stomach filled mostly with bread gruel and the occasional bit of salted pork. Yes, medieval food could be as unforgiving as the rest of your life. Let's start with the basics. Your daily meals were simple, repetitive, and designed more for survival than enjoyment. The staple was bread, often dark, dense and coarse, sometimes more like a brick than the fluffy loaves we enjoy today. Alongside this, you'd get pottage, a thick, watery stew made from whatever vegetables, grains or scraps were available. Meat was a luxury usually reserved for feast days or the very wealthy. Most peasants got their protein from beans, peas or the occasional fish, but don't expect filet mignon. Here's a quirky fact. Medieval people believed that certain foods had humoral properties, meaning they could affect your body's balance of heat, moisture and dryness. Eating too much cold food might cause illness, and spicy hot foods were often used to counteract it. So while you were chewing on stale bread, you might have also been worrying about your humours falling out of whack. Historians still debate how seriously people took these dietary rules, but they definitely influenced what made it onto your plate. Food scarcity was a constant threat. Bad harvests from those pesky weather disasters meant less bread and fewer vegetables. Famines were terrifyingly common, especially during the Little Ice Age, when shorter growing seasons meant food was often scarce. You might have had to rely on preserved food, salted pork, dried fish, and hard cheeses that could last through the winter, but tasted about as exciting as cardboard. Not exactly Michelin-star dining. On the bright side, you had some access to herbs and spices, though these were expensive and mostly used by the rich. Cinnamon, saffron and pepper were prized goods traded over vast distances. Imagine your village cook trying to stretch a pinch of pepper across a huge pot of stew, hoping no one noticed the lack of flavour. And then there was water, or rather the lack of clean water. Drinking water was often unsafe, contaminated by human and animal waste. Instead, people drank ale or weak beer, even children. The alcohol content was low enough to keep people hydrated, but strong enough to kill some bacteria. Your daily ration of ale was basically liquid bread. It might explain the medieval fondness for taverns, and the occasional rowdy brawl. Malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies were rampant. Lack of fresh fruits and vegetables led to scurvy and other health issues. Dental problems were common partly because of the gritty bread, and partly because sugar, when it arrived, was a rare and precious treat mostly for the wealthy. Medieval dentists, more like barbers with sharp knives. Now, here's a fringe tidbit. Some medieval recipes included bizarre ingredients like crushed pearls or powdered bones believed to have magical or medicinal properties. It's unclear whether anyone actually ate these with a smile, but they show how intertwined food medicine and superstition were. You might say they were the original superfoods with questionable benefits. Despite the often dreary diet, food was also a source of community and celebration. Feast days, harvest festivals, and religious holidays brought lavish spreads, communal meals, and rare treats. Even the humblest peasant might taste roasted meats, sweet pies, and spiced wines during these special occasions. Food wasn't just fuel, it was joy, hope, and a brief escape from daily hardship. Still, hunger was a constant companion. Rations could be meagre, and hunger pangs gnawed at your insides, especially during winter or bad harvest years. Malnutrition made you more vulnerable to illness and reduced your ability to work hard, trapping many in a vicious cycle of poverty and disease. Sleep, already challenged by aches, noise, and fear, was further undermined by a stomach that might be growling or cramping from poor diet or illness. Medieval medicine acknowledged the connection between food and health, but treatments were limited and often based on guesswork or superstition. In a world where every meal was a gamble, you learned to cherish what little you had, sometimes eating in silence or sharing scraps with family and neighbours. Food was a symbol of survival and community, and despite all the hardships, it connected people in the struggle against a harsh and unforgiving world. So as you lay down to rest, still smelling of soot and sweat, with aches in your limbs and a growling stomach, remember the medieval diet wasn't just a background detail. It was a relentless challenge that shaped your health, your energy, and your very ability to survive. But even if you managed to eat something decent and collapse into a hard bed, medieval nights weren't safe or quiet. Far from it. The dangers lurking in the dark were real, and often far more terrifying than the daylight grind. By now you're probably thinking, medieval life sounds like a non-stop series of unfortunate events. And you're right, but just when you thought the Forge Plague's curses, noises, hard labour and lousy food were enough, medieval nights brought a whole new set of dangers. Darkness wasn't just a lack of light, it was a realm of unseen threats that could haunt you awake or steal your breath away while you slept. First, let's talk about the humble candle or oil lamp, your only defence against the night's suffocating blackness. Light was precious and expensive. You didn't have flickering LED bulbs or glowing screens. You had a single candle that burned fast and smelled like a mix of wax and regret. Most people shared one light for the entire family, and when it went out, so did your sense of security. Medieval streets were pitch black after sunset. If you ventured outside, you risked tripping over unseen obstacles, stepping into a ditch, or worse, running into less friendly neighbours or bandits. Nighttime was when thieves, murderers and wolves roamed free. Villages had curfews and guards, but enforcement was spotty and lawlessness thrived in the shadows. Here's a quirky fact. Some towns hired knocker-uppers to tap on doors and windows early in the morning to wake workers. But at night, those same workers feared being knocked on by someone with darker intentions. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of medieval curfews. But one thing is clear, night was a time of heightened anxiety. Inside your home, dangers were just as real. Open hearths provided warmth and light, but also posed a constant fire risk. Fires were devastating, especially when homes were built close together, with wooden beams and thatched roofs. You might have lost everything in a night, forced to rebuild from ashes, or worse, lose your life. People often slept with one eye open, literally. Then there were the nightmares, not just in your head, but believed to be caused by night spirits or demons. Sleep paralysis, when you feel awake but unable to move, was attributed to the old hag or mare, a malevolent entity sitting on your chest. Many believed these night terrors were a sign of spiritual attack or impending doom. No wonder people were hesitant to drift off to sleep. A mainstream historical fact here: the phenomenon of sleep paralysis has likely haunted humans across cultures and eras. Medieval interpretations made it far scarier, weaving it into their spiritual worldview. Some even carried protective charms or recited prayers to ward off these night demons. Let's get into the eerie side. Graveyards, often located near churches, were believed to be hotspots for restless spirits. Some folks thought the dead might rise as revenants or ghosts haunting the living. Stories of vampires and zombies have roots in medieval fears and misunderstandings of disease and decomposition. You might find villagers sleeping with steaks or garlic hung over their beds, not just superstition, but genuine attempts to keep the dead at bay. There were also beliefs about witches flying at night, gathering for secret Sabbaths to curse the innocent. People thought the thin veil between worlds was at its weakest during the witching hour. No one wanted to be caught outside or even alone in their home after midnight. Now for a fringe tidbit. Some medieval manuscripts describe night travellers, souls that left their bodies to journey through the spirit world during sleep. This idea blends with shamanistic practices and suggests a fascinating intersection between sleep spirituality and consciousness. Historians still debate how widespread this belief was, but it adds a mystical layer to medieval nights. As if that wasn't enough, your dreams themselves were battlegrounds. Nightmares were feared as spiritual warfare messages from the divine or the devil. You might dream of falling, drowning, or being chased, and in medieval thought, these weren't just random images, but omens or warnings. Sleep was a double-edged sword necessary for survival, but fraught with peril. The fear of what lurked in the dark, combined with physical exhaustion and mental stress, meant many went to bed, tense, alert, and far from peaceful. So you see, the medieval night was not a gentle descent into rest, but a fraught passage through darkness and danger, both seen and unseen. And if you thought the night was long and harsh, wait until you learn about the medieval medical scene, where healing was part science, part superstition, and entirely unpredictable. You've survived the forge, the fleas, the relentless weather, plague, curses, noise, hard labour, bad food and terrifying nights. Now it's time to face the medieval doctor, or as you might have called them, a person who could either save your life or accidentally end it faster than a runaway horse. Medieval medicine was a curious mix of observation, superstition, and what we would now call trial and error, with a dash of hope and a lot of prayer. First off, the medical knowledge you'd encounter was rudimentary by modern standards. The concept of germs was non-existent. Disease was mostly blamed on imbalanced humours, blood phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. Doctors believed that illness was caused by an excess or deficiency of these fluids, so treatments aimed to restore balance, often with bloodletting. Yes, your doctor might open a vein and let you bleed out a bit to fix whatever was wrong. Charming, right? Here's a mainstream historical fact. Bloodletting was a common practice well into the 19th century, despite often doing more harm than good. It was so standard that barbers often doubled as surgeons, wielding razors not just for haircuts, but for medical procedures. Medical tools looked more like medieval torture devices than healing instruments. You'd find scalpels, cautery irons, heated until red hot, and even leech jars. The idea was that the pain inflicted by these tools could somehow chase out illness. Spoiler, it didn't. A quirky tidbit some doctors prescribed: powdered mummy, yes, actual ground-up Egyptian mummies, believing the ancient power of the remains had healing properties. This practice, called mumia, was popular well into the Renaissance. If you thought powdered unicorn horn was strange, this tops the list. Medieval doctors also relied heavily on astrology. Your diagnosis might depend on the alignment of stars and planets. If Mars was in retrograde, expect a less favourable prognosis. Treatments were often timed to the lunar calendar to maximise healing energies. Historians still argue about how seriously this was taken, but it undeniably shaped medical practice. Let's not forget the apothecaries, medieval pharmacists who brewed potions from herbs, roots and sometimes downright bizarre ingredients. Their shops smelled like a cross between a garden and a witch's cauldron. You could buy remedies for everything, from headaches to love potions, but quality varied wildly. Now here's the scary part. A surgery was a last resort, and often performed without anaesthesia. Imagine having a broken bone set or a tumour removed while fully awake, gripping your straw mattress and hoping for divine intervention. Mortality rates were high, but if you survived, you were considered tough as nails. Some fringe treatments involved magic and prayer. Healing charms, holy relics, and pilgrimages to sacred sites were common. If the doctor couldn't fix you, maybe a saint could. Medieval medicine wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, and often the two were inseparable. Now, the medieval hospital wasn't like modern clinics. They were often run by religious orders and served as places of charity rather than centres of advanced medicine. The sick and poor were cared for, but cures were rare. Sometimes hospitals doubled as quarantine stations to keep the plague from spreading. Despite all this, the medieval medical tradition laid important groundwork. Herbal knowledge, surgical techniques, and the concept of systematic observation slowly evolved over centuries into modern medicine. But for you, the patient, it was a gamble every time you stepped into the doctor's tent or apothecary shop. After facing the physical world's dangers and the dubious promises of medieval medicine, it's no wonder medieval folks sought refuge in dreams, not just as rest, but as a mysterious realm where healing messages and transformations might happen. But as you'll see, even dreams came with their own risks and enigmas. By the time you've weathered the brutal realities of medieval work food, night terrors and questionable medical care, you might think sleep would finally bring some peace. But nope, enter the mysterious, often unsettling world of medieval dreams. For the folks back then, dreams were far from random. They were messages, warnings, sometimes prophecies, and occasionally a backstage pass to the divine, or a trap set by evil spirits. Unlike our modern tendency to dismiss dreams as the brain's messy afterthoughts, medieval people took their dreams seriously. They believed the night's visions could shape destinies, influence political decisions, and even foretell battles or famine. You might wake up from a vivid nightmare and immediately consult the village seer or priest, desperate to decode what the gods were trying to tell you. Dream interpretation was a serious business. There were entire texts and manuals devoted to decoding symbolism. For example, seeing a snake in a dream could mean transformation, but it could just as easily mean danger or deceit depending on the context. Flying might symbolise freedom or escape, but also death or spiritual ascension. The interpretations were as varied as the dreams themselves, and historians still argue about how consistent these meanings really were. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The Ionero Critica, a famous ancient Greek text on dream interpretation, was still widely referenced during the Middle Ages. It guided priests, nobles and peasants alike in understanding their nocturnal visions. Dream symbols were layered and complex, often combining personal experience with cultural and religious significance. Dreams also intersected with medieval spirituality in fascinating ways. People believed that during sleep, the soul could leave the body and travel to other realms, communicate with spirits, or even visit heaven or hell. This belief led to the practice of incubation, sleeping in sacred places like temples or churches to receive divine guidance or healing through dreams. The boundary between physical and spiritual worlds was blurry. A quirky tidbit: some medieval hospitals had dream chambers where the sick would sleep hoping for healing visions. Patients would fast pray and then rest believing that their dreams could lead to cures or spiritual breakthroughs. Imagine the waiting room full of people nodding off with hopeful eyes. But dreams weren't always comforting. Nightmares called incubi or succubi, when believed to be caused by demons, could torment sleepers, leading to sleep paralysis and a feeling of suffocation. People were genuinely terrified that these creatures might steal their souls or cause illness. Protective prayers, amulets, and rituals were common nightly defences. There was also a political angle. Monarchs and leaders sometimes claimed divine messages in dreams to legitimize their rule or justify actions. "The gods told me in a dream" was a powerful claim that could sway entire kingdoms. Dreamers held a unique position, sometimes revered, sometimes feared. Now here's a fringe tidbit. Some mystics believed that dreams could be manipulated or sent to others, a form of medieval psychic warfare. While historians debate the prevalence of this belief, it adds an intriguing layer of supernatural espionage to medieval nightlife. Despite the fear and fascination, dreams offered a form of hope and control. In a world where daily life was unpredictable and harsh, dreams were a space where people could search for meaning, receive guidance, or at least find temporary escape. They were both a mirror of waking fears and a window into transcendent possibilities. So as you drift into your own dreams tonight, consider this: for medieval folks, sleep was never just rest. It was a journey into mystery, a conversation with the divine, and sometimes a battlefield where the soul fought for survival. The final piece of this medieval puzzle leads us to an unexpected place: secret underground cities where people literally hid from the world's dangers. Because if the dangers of day and night weren't enough, some took refuge deep beneath the earth. Imagine waking up one day to find that the safest place to live isn't above ground, with sunshine and fresh air, but deep underground in a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers carved from volcanic rock. Welcome to the strange, astonishing world of medieval underground cities, where survival took on a literal new dimension. These vast subterranean complexes weren't mere caves or hideouts. They were entire living communities, built to escape the constant threats of war, invasion, and famine. Take Cappadocia in modern-day Turkey, for instance. Beneath its surreal landscape of fairy chimneys and volcanic formations lies a sprawling network of underground cities, some descending as many as 18 stories, and capable of sheltering thousands of people. It's like a medieval Airbnb, only with less Wi-Fi and more bats. These cities were designed for long-term habitation, with ventilation shafts, wells tapping into underground aquifers, communal kitchens, chapels, and even schools. The architecture was so sophisticated that large rolling stone doors could seal off tunnels from invaders, and narrow corridors forced enemies to approach single file, giving defenders a strategic edge. Historians still argue about who exactly built these cities and when. Some say early Christians fleeing Roman or Arab persecution expanded them, while others suggest earlier civilizations, like the Hittites, started digging thousands of years before Christ. The mystery deepens when you realize these cities were not hastily constructed bunkers, but carefully planned multi-layered complexes indicating generations of engineering and adaptation. Here's a quirky fact. Many of these underground cities were linked by secret tunnels stretching kilometres, allowing inhabitants to move unseen between communities. Think of it as a medieval subway system, minus the trains, and with a much higher chance of bumping into bats or a startled goat. Life underground wasn't easy. Darkness was constant, air quality was a concern, and the threat of structural collapse was ever present. Yet these people thrived in their inverted world, preserving culture, religion, and community beneath the surface, while the world above was often engulfed in chaos. The reasons for going underground remain a subject of intense debate. The most accepted theory points to constant warfare and invasions in the region, pushing entire populations to disappear beneath the earth to wait out danger. But more fringe ideas suggest these cities might have been refugees from natural disasters like volcanic eruptions, solar flares, or even otherworldly beings from myths and legends, sky gods or watchers that inspired fear and flight. Living underground also had spiritual significance. Descending into the earth was sometimes seen as a metaphor for death and rebirth, a journey through the underworld with the promise of renewal. In a world where the line between the physical and spiritual was thin, these cities may have been sanctuaries, not just of survival, but of transformation. It's worth noting that even today, much of these underground networks remain unexplored. Archaeologists continue to uncover new tunnels, chambers, and artifacts, slowly piecing together the lives of those who lived beneath our feet. Walking through these shadowy halls, you can't help but feel connected to something ancient and mysterious, a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. Now, after all you've learned, the ceaseless toil at the forge, the ever-present threats from plague and superstition, the poor diet, the perilous nights, the dubious doctors, the enigmatic dreams, and the hidden cities, one thing is clear: medieval life was an unending dance with danger. But it was also a story of endurance, creativity, and community. So, as you close your eyes tonight, remember the blacksmith who hammered out civilization in sweat and soot, the villagers who listened to the language of dreams, and the underground architects who carved hope into stone. Their legacy may not be in grand castles or crowned thrones, but in the quiet, relentless heartbeat of survival, the fire that never goes out.